Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material into the House record H.R. 2811.
Without objection.
I don't think the chamber is.
The House will be in order. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2811, the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. Over the last 2 years, President Biden has financed his radical agenda and vast expansion of the federal government with an unprecedented $10 trillion in spending, $6 trillion of which has been added to our national debt, the highest level of deficit spending in the history of America. This unbridled spending spree has resulted in sustained record inflation, soaring interest rates, an economy in a recessionary tailspin, and a nation on the brink of a catastrophic debt crisis. Mr. Speaker, the fiscal state of the nation is bleak, our national debt is unsustainable, and the outlook grows more uncertain every day. For 100 years, the debt ceiling has served as a check on our accumulating debt and its impact on the financial health of our nation. No responsible leader can look at the rapid deterioration of our balance sheet and the unsustainability of our deficit spending and stand idly by defending status quo. Friends, this isn't a Republican problem. It's not a Democrat problem. It's America's problem. And it's a mathematic reality that requires real leadership from both sides of the aisle and before it's too late. House Republicans' debt ceiling proposal is an important first step to getting our fiscal house in order and a good faith effort to bring the president to the negotiating table. Our plan will reduce deficit spending, save taxpayers $4.8 trillion, and begin extinguishing the flames of our current cost of living crisis. First, we limit federal spending by reining in and right-sizing the federal bureaucracy. Our bill will reduce FY24 discretionary spending levels by 9%, $130 billion, returning us to the same spending levels we were operating under just 4 months ago. Going forward, we will cap the growth of discretionary spending by 1% annually over the next 10 years, reducing wasteful Washington spending by over $3 trillion. Mr. Speaker, put simply, this bill would require Washington to do what every American has been forced to do as a result of Biden's spending-induced inflation: tighten our belts and change our spending habits. Second, we save taxpayer dollars by reversing some of the Democrats' reckless spending, reclaiming tens of billions in unspent COVID funds, defunding the president's army of 87,000 IRS agents, repealing special interest tax breaks for the largest green energy corporations, and rescinding President Biden's unconstitutional student loan bailout. Third, this legislation will grow the economy by returning to pro-work, pro-growth, pro-energy policies that will unleash American prosperity once again. It stops the assault on U.S. energy production and restores American energy dominance. It reins in Biden's unprecedented barrage of regulations, and it breaks the cycle of poverty and government dependence for generations of Americans by restoring common sense, Clinton-era work requirements for able-bodied adults. Mr. Speaker, it's time to get America back to work. Turn this economy loose and let the tide of prosperity lift all boats. We have put forward a plan worthy of the people we serve, and now we must put aside political small-mindedness and rise to meet the enormous challenge facing our great nation. If we fail to meet this moment, we risk being the first generation in history to leave our children a weaker America, with fewer opportunities and a lower standard of living. Let me be clear. We will pay our creditors. We will protect the good faith and credit of the United States, but we will not give this president or any politician a blank check to bankrupt our country. Mr. Speaker, this is where the reckless spending stops. This is where we speak up for our children. This is where we fight together to save our country. I urge all of my colleagues to support H.R. 2811, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
So recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my friends on the other side of the aisle will claim they are being, quote, fiscally responsible. Let's be clear. There never has been and never will be anything fiscally responsible about refusing to pay America's bills. Killing millions of jobs is also not fiscally responsible. Neither is knowingly unleashing a recession. That is why even former President Trump said, quote, I can't imagine anybody ever even thinking of using the debt ceiling as a negotiating tool. Now, I had hoped that when the Speaker referred to the budget process and debt ceiling as, quote, apples and oranges, it meant my friends on the other side finally understood the real-world ramifications of their reckless brinksmanship. And yet here we are. Republicans' DOA Act, the Default on America Act, will cut investments, crush job creation, and crash the economy. Their Default on America Act must be DOA. There is no way Congress will agree to 10 years of destructive caps and the biggest single cut to non-defense programs in American history. And for what? In exchange for a few months of respite before we would have to go through this debt ceiling roller coaster all over again. Now, Mr. Speaker, the American people may be wondering, when they hear what I just said, the biggest single cut to non-defense programs in the history of the American government, they might be wondering what exactly that means. Well, here are some specifics. First, in total, we are talking about an immediate cut of at least $142 billion. That would mean, for example, public safety. After recent near misses, under this bill, 125 air traffic control towers would be shut down, impacting 1/3 of all airports. Following the disastrous derailments in eastern Ohio and West Virginia, rail safety jobs would be dramatically reduced, with 11,000 fewer safety inspection days and 30,000 fewer miles of track inspected annually. Our communities will be less safe with the cut of federal support to 60 local law enforcement agencies, 300 to 400 fewer local law enforcement positions, as well as approximately 11,000 fewer FBI personnel. On health, amid a mental health and overdose crisis, nearly 1 million people facing a suicidal or mental health crisis would be unable to access support services through the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And tens of thousands of individuals could be denied admission to opioid use disorder treatment. In terms of families and on nutrition, with the looming rise of food insecurity, nutrition services such as Meals on Wheels would be cut for more than 1 million seniors. How can we allow this to happen? We simply cannot and must not. Now, many of us on this side of the aisle who will be speaking will detail even more of the cuts that are included in this DOA Default on America Act. But for now, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves time. Gentleman from The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the last time we had a significant fiscal reform came through debt ceiling negotiations that were led by no other than President Joe Biden in 2011. But now I'd like to yield 90 seconds to my good friend from New York, Mike Lawler.
Thank you, Chairman. Throughout this debate, I have had three basic parameters. The President and the Majority Leader must negotiate with the Speaker, we must cut spending, and we must not default. This bill, the Limit, Save, and Grow Act, is a beginning and puts the President and Senate Majority Leader on notice. The days of one-party rule are over. The American people elected a House Republican majority to serve as a check and balance on the reckless, out-of-control spending that was the hallmark of the last 2 years. $5 trillion in new spending, $10 trillion total, a 41-year record high on inflation, skyrocketing energy costs, America saddled with over $31 trillion in debt and counting. It cannot continue. This bill would save Americans $4.8 trillion over the next decade. It would restore fiscal year 22 spending, which every Democrat previously voted for and supported. If it was good 4 months ago, why is it not today? And it would cap future spending at 1% per year. It would claw back billions in unspent COVID funds, which the President has acknowledged COVID is now over. It would stop the hiring of 87,000 new IRS agents and employees. It would restore work requirements on able-bodied Americans, requirements previously championed by President Joe Biden and President Bill Clinton. And it would unleash American energy, increasing domestic production while reducing costs for consumers and ending our reliance on foreign oil. Simply put, we cannot continue to borrow and print new money at the levels this administration has. Republicans and Democrats must come together to rein in spending, protect vital programs like Social Security and Medicare, reduce inflation, and avoid default. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield another 20 seconds to my colleague.
The gentleman is recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. This bill begins the conversation, and President Biden and Senator Schumer must now come to the negotiating table and work with Speaker McCarthy in good faith to move our country forward and restore fiscal sanity and solvency. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi, Speaker Emerita of the House.
The gentlelady is recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him, Mr. Boyle, and Mr. Richie Neal for their leadership in bringing our side of the story to this. And what is that? I thank the Republicans for the clarity with which they have put forth their Default on America Act, because their Default on American Act will do just this. When you vote for this bill, you will vote to put veterans' health care at risk, eliminating up to 30 million health care visits for our veterans, slash Pell Grants for tens of thousands of students, rip away food assistance for women, infant, and children, 1 million of them, 1 million seniors off of Meals on Wheels. When you vote for this, you will vote to pollute the planet by overturning what we did to save the planet with green tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. You will, what is amazing, a vote to cut $8 billion in law enforcement from state, local, and federal law enforcement, pulling cops off the street, and lead to up to 700,000 fewer jobs to be created. Certainly we negotiate over the appropriations bills. I'm an appropriator, and for 20 years I've been in 19 engagements of the debt ceiling kind. Whether we lift the debt ceiling is a question of whether we honor the Constitution that says that our full faith and credit of America shall not be in doubt. When you use that as a wedge, as President Trump admonished you not to, you are placing in doubt our credit rating and what that means to American people on their credit cards, bills, and at the kitchen table. You are playing with fire. We've been down this road before. When the former president was president, 3 times we lifted the debt ceiling, never placing in doubt the full faith and credit of the United States of America. I urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas. recognized.
Mr. Speaker, when President Biden negotiated the fiscal reforms and the debt ceiling in 2011, he said he was pleased and thankful to do it. He called it a normal process. He said that you got to compromise, doesn't like the my way, highway approach, and said it was a great honor. I hope he shares those sentiments today and soon. Now I want to yield to my colleague from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for 90 seconds, Dan Muser.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my good friend from Texas, Chairman of the Budget Committee. Mr. Speaker, we are debating a bill to accomplish goals of equal importance. Pay the national debt, pay the nation's debts, and begin a discussion with a plan so as we demonstrate to the American people, we in this House will rein in the astronomically excessive spending of the past 3 years. The American people deserve and demand, Mr. Speaker, that we do this. It is right and just. We must pay our nation's debts. Yet, they don't want to see the excesses continue. That sentiment is pervasive. Over the past 3 years, we have increased our national debt by almost $12 trillion. Some due to COVID, most due to ideology and complete lack of fiscal restraint. Our plan pays our nation's debts, and we must as well limit federal excesses moving forward. And, Mr. Speaker, back to 2022 levels. We're not talking about going into disasters here. 2022 levels with increases moving forward. It saves by largely reclaiming COVID funds. COVID is over. Those funds are available. They should be reclaimed. And by creating growth initiatives, which we must have, Mr. Speaker, in order to compete globally and assure the American dream stays alive for our children. The White House and this House must cooperate and do what is right and just. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I would remind my fellow Pennsylvanian, as well as all the members of this House, that according to Moody's Analytics, the legislation that is in front of us, quote, would meaningfully increase the likelihood of a recession and lead to 800,000 job losses by the end of 2024. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, the ranking member of the Education and Workforce Committee, Mr. Scott.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to oppose the reckless default on our debt act. Unfortunately, those on the other side of the aisle have taken the full faith and credit of the United States hostage and has offered a terrible deal for the American people. Either they'll inflict cruel cuts on vital programs for working families, or they'll destroy the economy. Earlier this week, as it's been pointed out, this plan has been evaluated. Almost 800,000 jobs will be lost. And when they say the cuts aren't that bad, well, tell that to 200,000 children who lose access to Head Start, 100,000 parents who lose access to child care, the 26 million students who are in Title I schools who will get cuts in funding, or 6.6 million students who lose money in Pell Grants, or the tens of millions who lose the funding for the student debt relief that's been promised. These spending cuts are necessary, frankly, to pay for the Republican tax cuts that weren't paid for at the time. 80% of the Trump tax cuts were scheduled to go to the top 1% in corporations, and now we're going to pay for them with cuts to education, health care, veterans programs, and others. I get tired of being lectured by the Republicans when it comes to fiscal responsibility, because we know that every Republican presidential administration since Nixon has left office with a worse deficit situation than they inherited, and every Democratic administration since Kennedy has left office with a better deficit situation than they inherited. And so Democrats are ready to act to prevent a devastating economic default, just as we did 3 times under the Trump administration with little fanfare. President Biden and Democrats have already significantly cut the deficit, and we're willing to do more, but we want to do it in a way that is responsible and helps families. This bill hurts families, and we need to oppose the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Republican tax cuts gave us unprecedented growth and prosperity It lifted 6 million people out of poverty, had the lowest poverty rate in the history of our great nation. Biden's budget recently, highest levels of sustained spending, borrowing, and taxes in the history of the country. At this point, I'd like to yield to my dear friend from North Carolina. She is a champion for fiscal responsibility, Chairwoman Virginia Foxx.
How much time, sir? For how much time?
For 2 minutes.
Thank you. Gentlewoman's recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Texas for yielding and for his wonderful work on this package. America's position as the most trusted line of credit in the world is at stake. In other words, our reputation is at stake. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Republicans' common sense proposal, the Limit, Save, Grow Act, recognizes the twin interest of avoiding defaulting on our debt while reining in future inflationary spending. Yet the President has signaled that he will stall, he will risk, and he will forbid paying our debt obligations if he doesn't get his way. He refuses to compromise. One such compromise, which falls within the jurisdiction of the Committee on Education and the Workforce, includes blocking the President from spending $500 billion to provide backdoor free college. The Limit, Save, Grow Act would nullify the President's plan to transfer up to $20,000 per borrower onto the backs of blue-collar Americans, as well as his radical income-driven repayment plan, which would turn student loans into untargeted grants and cost more than any other regulation in our nation's history. If the President's student loan scheme is enacted, taxpayers could end up spending almost $1 trillion since the beginning of the pandemic. Our solution preserves the fiscal integrity of our nation for Americans today and the generation tomorrow. It offers a promise to the American public that we will not pursue trillion-dollar policies that risk our financial future. Mr. Speaker, we ask the President to come to the negotiating table and quit pursuing brinksmanship over partisanship. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Preventing default is an obligation that Congress has. My Republican colleagues are holding our economy hostage, linking it to the annual process of funding the critical programs that serve American families and veterans. The price of averting a catastrophic default is drastic cuts to these programs now and severe caps for the next 10 years. Republicans claim that veterans' health care would be protected. That is not the case. For 6 hours during the Rules Committee meeting last night, I told House Republicans that veterans had no protections whatsoever in their debt default bill. Given the look on their faces, I believe I was the one to inform them of the immediate $2 billion recession that robs veterans of timely access to health care services. I do not think they know what is in their own bill. You know what they did after 6 hours of debate? Nothing for veterans. You know what they did after hearing from dozens of veteran and military service organizations about the lack of protections in the bill? Nothing for veterans. In the middle of the night, they made last-minute changes to win over Republican holdouts. You know what they did after going back to the drawing board? Nothing for veterans. Nothing to fix the $2 billion rescission. Nothing to protect veterans from a 22% cut. Nothing to maintain our commitment to veterans who have been exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange, and other toxic substances. This is shameful. This default and cuts bill should not even come to this floor for a vote. Our veterans sacrificed for us. We owe them the benefits that they have already earned. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill and vote yes for veterans. And by voting no, you say yes to veterans. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
My colleagues act like there are no alternatives for funding cuts and savings, like there's no waste, woke, and bloat in the federal government. The president himself has issued 800 executive orders totaling $1.5 trillion. One of those items is a student loan bailout that benefits 2 out of 3 highest income earners in our country. It's costing taxpayers $700 billion. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 90 seconds to my dear friend and colleague on the Budget Committee, Bob Good.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chairman from Texas. I rise in support of reducing federal spending at long last. Democrats would never willingly agree to cut spending, as evidenced by what did the president just propose, a record $7 trillion budget with a record $2 trillion deficit if that plan were ever to see the light of day. We're going to utilize this opportunity, this debt ceiling limit being reached, to negotiate or to force, finally, some fiscal responsibility and some cuts to our spending. But President Biden and my friends across the aisle want to continue to exceed America's credit card limit without any consideration of how or why we got here. If an individual spent the way this federal government spends, they would be in jail. Think about it. Spending money that's not yours, writing checks when you know the funds aren't there. What would you call that? The Limit, Save, Grow Act is the solution to shrink Washington and grow America. Immediate upfront cuts and spending reforms, saving over $500 billion in 2 years, and nearly $5 trillion over 10 years. Rescinding the unspent COVID funds, eliminating the student loan transfer scheme, eliminating the $80 billion for the weaponized IRS, eliminating climate-reckless environmental funding, and capping growth at 1% each year. I urge all of my colleagues to vote in favor of this proposal to put us on a path to fiscal stability, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Grijalva.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, the Default on America Act is foolish. It's harmful. It's a harmful piece of legislation offered to appease the Republican Party's most extreme fringe. Republicans' plan to handle the debt limit is not a plan at all. It's a ransom note that threatens aggressively to take our country backward, and everybody loses. Either Republicans force default, which results in skyrocketing student loans, veterans losing out on hard-earned benefits, and countless other incomprehensible effects that will hit the most vulnerable the hardest, but will hit working folk, middle-class folk just hard as well. Or Republicans can enact their tone-deaf economic agenda, giving a huge windfall to billionaires and oil barons while cutting food assistance from poor families, children, and older people. If Republicans had their way, they'd strip our communities of the right to fight back against polluting industries while padding big oil's pockets. They'd cut funding for climate science while reversing the progress Democrats have made on clean energy. They'd do absolutely nothing to address emissions. In fact, they'd give companies free passes to pollute while cutting funding to fight wildfires and provide drought relief. They say they will help American families, but if it slashes already underfunded tribal education programs and Indian child welfare programs. And their budget would make it harder to tackle wildfires and drought in the West. This bill is not what the American people want. Our communities want clean air, clean water. They want to be able to put food on the table. They want good, stable jobs, and they want the federal government to face climate change head on. I urge my colleagues to stand up against the Default on America Act, vote no, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, you're going to hear a number of vulnerable people, communities that get federal funding, but you will not hear, I bet, anything about the most vulnerable group of people in this country, and that is the next generation of Americans who will inherit $31 trillion in debt, the highest levels of indebtedness in our nation's history. Where are they in this debate? That's the big question. Who's speaking up for them? That's a big question. But I know my colleague Stephanie Bice from Oklahoma will, and I'll yield her 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act of 2023. Like any family, Republicans are proposing living within our means, not continuing to rack up a balance on American taxpayers' credit card. In contrast, President Biden has unilaterally spent $1.5 trillion on over 800 executive actions. My colleagues want to quote the former president. Let me quote President Biden. A direct quote from 2012, he said, "Securing a deal with Republicans was a, quote, great honor." He hasn't bothered to come to the negotiating table, Mr. Speaker. What has changed? The three main pillars of this legislation will benefit hardworking Americans by limiting federal spending, saving taxpayer dollars, and growing the economy. I am especially pleased to see key energy provisions included in this package. The best way to lower prices is to cut spending and unleash American energy, allowing states like Oklahoma to power our nation. Cutting bureaucratic red tape is especially important for energy producers who have dealt with the stifling regulations at the hands of President Biden. Mr. Speaker, I ask for an additional 30 seconds.
I yield another 30 seconds to my colleague.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
America is $31 trillion in debt, and the American people are demanding solutions. The White House says, show me your proposal and we can negotiate. Well, Mr. President, it is time to come to the table and do so in good faith. We must get this done. I urge all of my colleagues to support this effort. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair, please. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, just to be clear, to correct the record, 3 times under former President Trump, the debt ceiling was increased. Many of us on this side of the aisle voted for it, even though as a president, not of our own party. And in those 3 debt ceiling increases, 0 of them, 0, included cuts to any government spending. In fact, 2 of them included increases to government spending. With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Higgins.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition of H.R. 2811. Under President Biden, we have created 12 million jobs, including 800,000 manufacturing jobs. Unemployment is at a 54-year low. The previous administration lost in 4 years 3 million jobs, including nearly 300,000 manufacturing jobs. This irresponsible proposal on the floor today would tank our economic recovery and hurt hardworking families, and it would not be good for my Western New York district. Throughout the pandemic, this Congress worked together to keep families strong amidst unprecedented uncertainty. So it is shocking how anti-family bill this is. This bill will lead to less health care for parents and children. More kids would go to bed hungry because their parents can't afford food. It would cut health care for veterans, hurting not only them, but their families and caregivers as well. Congress raised the debt limit nearly 80 times since 1960, the majority taking place under Republican presidents. It's time for the GOP to stop playing games with the livelihood of American families. I ask my colleagues to join me in rejecting this proposal and instead pass a clean bill that prevents the first default in our nation's history. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, you'll hear many of the tired, old, false choices like hungry children, struggling families. I would remind you and the people of our great country who are experiencing sustained levels of 40-year high inflation, who are struggling to put food on the table, that has come as a result of reckless spending here in Washington. There are a lot of programs, Global Equity Fund, electric buses and ferries, $80 billion for IRS agents, $27 billion for a climate slush fund. I could go on and on. You will not hear any of that from my friends on the other side of the aisle. I'd like to yield 1 minute to my colleague on the Budget Committee and friend from North Carolina, Chuck Edwards.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. This legislation takes monumental steps in reining in federal spending by not cutting, but just returning to spending levels of just a year ago, and spurring economic growth and restoring the fiscal sanity that our nation desperately needs. As our national debt is now at nearly $31.5 trillion, or $95,000 per person, our current fiscal trajectory is simply unsustainable. It's immoral and it's unfair to future generations who will be the ones responsible for paying off this insurmountable debt. This legislation will help restore the American economy, unleash American energy, and reverse decades of runaway spending. I applaud the work of Chairman Arrington, his leadership, and for his tireless efforts to help bring us to this critical moment in our nation's history. I'm proud to support this legislation, and with
Gentleman's
that,
time
I
has
yield
expired.
back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania, recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The woman from Texas is recognized.
No American, no patriot would stand on this floor representing the American people and argue for the default on America legislation. To refuse to pay our bills is an insult to the men and women who swore to die for this country. You want to know why? Because it would cut 30 million visits from veterans at the Veterans Hospital, 81,000 jobs from Veterans Health Administration. It would increase the wait times for benefits like pensions and jeopardize the National Security Administration caring for our cemeteries. If you're in retirement, $20,000 could be lost out of your retirement. Is that patriotic? In addition, you'd cut low-income students. You would cut and cause the expense of colleges to go up in Texas and around the nation. In the 18th Congressional District, you would jeopardize Social Security payments for 61,000, put public health benefits at risk for 242,000 people, and increase lifetime mortgage costs. And you'd raise the debt $1.74 trillion. This is unpatriotic. It is not representative of what America stands for. Vote against a bill that strips food assistance from 4,000 Texans. I yield back.
No. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, again, with all due respect to my colleague from Texas, they will act as if these are the choices, but they're false choices, because they could choose to defund the monies that came from Democrat earmarks to companies that create dirt bike culture, or maybe, with all due respect to the First Lady, the Michelle Obama trail in North Carolina. There's a list of things. You will not hear them today in this debate, or any concern, in my opinion, for our children's future as it relates to the debt. I yield 1 minute to my colleague on the Budget Committee, Glenn Grothman from Wisconsin.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I think it's important that everybody in this chamber, as well as everybody around America, understands the precarious situation we are in with regard to the debt of this country. At the end of World War II, we had the debt was equal to about 100% of GDP. But in World War II, we knew we were going to stop making tanks, stop making planes, stop making ships, and we're going to lay off a lot of the military folks. Now, we have no easy place to go. Now, then the debt dropped from 100% down to 20%, went up to 40%, and since the Great Recession, it shot up to near 100% again, near the all-time record. The Biden administration has shown no ability to say no to anybody. You look at the budget they proposed, Department of Interior, 9% increase, Commerce, 11% increase, Education, almost a 14% increase. Wherever you look, they still have the foot on the gas. America's got to realize for our children and grandchildren, we have got to now finally say no just a little bit. Thank you.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Espiat.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I stand here in opposition of the Default on American Act. House Republicans' debt default bill before us here today holds the economy hostage in exchange for slashing investment in American families to the tune of $4.5 trillion in cuts. This has happened. The debt ceiling extension has happened 78 times, Mr. Speaker, 49 times under Republican administrations. So this is not new. This is an artificial crisis which can create catastrophic economic conditions across the world. Not just the United States economy, but the world economy can be affected. Police officers on the street will be cut through the Department of Justice. Veteran benefits. Working moms will no longer have daycare. That's what this accomplishes, this Default on American Act. I stand in opposition, Mr. Speaker, and I ask my colleagues to do the same.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
More apocalypse now from my colleagues instead of electric vehicle tax breaks for people who make $150,000. Not a priority when you're $31 trillion in debt. Government subsidized health care for people making over $300,000. Not a priority when you have a 10-year tripling of our interest, doubling of our annual deficits, and a bleak outlook for our children. Somebody that's very concerned about that, a good friend, Victoria Sparks from Indiana. I yield 1 minute.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to urge my Democrat colleagues to unite with Republicans and put pressure on the Senate to have an adult conversation about our debt and spending. We collected $4 trillion last year. Our mandatory spending is $4 trillion, automatic spending, and from around $2 trillion of discretionary spending, 80% is unauthorized. So it means that 90% of spending is not even considered by this institution. We have programs like Medicare is going bankrupt, and we have bipartisan issues supported by Trump and Obama could save billions of dollars for the seniors to save Medicare, like site-neutral payments, overbilling by Medicare. It's a fraudulent overbilling, dishonest billing that's supported by broad groups of think tanks. We have to save these programs for people that we promise, and we need to have the backbone in Washington, D.C. to stand up for we the people and challenge special interest groups. I urge you to be with us on this issue, and I yield back.
From Pennsylvania is recognized.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I keep hearing this doom and gloom from the other side of the aisle that we're on the brink of catastrophe. Here is the headline in the world's leading economic magazine, a magazine that is considered right of center. This is their headline 2 weeks ago. America's astonishing economic record. The world's biggest economy is leaving its peers even further in the dust. That is the accurate record of where this country and its economy stands right now. And with that, I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
I recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to the Default on America Act because I did not come to Congress to starve children. 34 million Americans struggle with food insecurity, 9 million of which are children. This bill would strip millions of hardworking Americans of benefits by expanding so-called work requirements in SNAP. SNAP already has a work requirement for individuals ages 18 to 49, but Republicans want to expand this to older Americans and seniors who face age discrimination in the workplace already. It's also important to note that the House Subcommittee on Nutrition Programs, the one who would be in charge of this, has yet to hold one hearing. So while proposing work requirements, the Committee on Nutrition has yet to begin work. It is horrifying that Republicans are choosing to hold the economy hostage and using vulnerable families as a bargaining tool. I urge my colleagues to have some compassion and vote against this devastating legislation.
Gentleman from Texas.
With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect to my friend and colleague, we are trapping millions of people in poverty and dependence on the government because we are not incentivizing people to move up and out of welfare so they can realize their greatest God-given potential. It is not compassionate to not expect the best out of our fellow Americans. President Biden, when he voted to support common sense welfare to work reforms, said this: we need to replace a culture of welfare with a culture of work. We need to replace a culture of dependency with a culture of self-sufficiency. I agree with the Joe Biden that said that then. I hope he will come to his senses, come to the table, and do what he did in 2011, include responsible fiscal reforms as we lift the debt ceiling and pay our bills. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to my colleague from Iowa, Zach Nunn.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Americans are demanding action. The President cannot put forth a budget that is 55% higher than it was at pre-pandemic levels. We must get together and work with what Chairman Arrington and the Speaker and the House Republicans have put forward. A budget that holds our government accountable. A budget that addresses the debt ceiling now, that gets federal spending under control, and grows our economy by letting Americans keep more of the money they've earned. That is why I'm honored as part of the Iowa delegation to hold firm, and that America's fiscal security, energy security, and food security can be led with us. In Iowa, we will not allow government to balance its budget on the backs of America's farmers. That's why I'm proud that this bill makes critical investments in biofuels. Biofuels that empower American energy independence, biofuel infrastructure that decreases the cost of fuels overseas and helps our families at the pump, biofuels that grow our Main Street businesses, and biofuels that empower our farmers for what they need to both feed and fuel the world. I salute the Iowans and the Americans who have worked to balance their own budgets every month. Those who don't spend tirelessly and put it on the credit card.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I could have given you some more time. Did you get close?
To the gentlewoman from Vermont, distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Ballant.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2811, the Default on America Act. A budget reflects our values, and we can plainly see where the Republicans' priorities lie. They're threatening default with catastrophic consequences. And why? Why? So they can secure 10 years of devastating cuts that American families depend on. Those programs will be devastated. Republicans have to abandon this dangerous path. America pays our bills. We must prevent default, as we have done countless times under Democratic and Republican presidents, including President Trump. A default will be a terrible blow to low-income and middle-income Americans. They don't care about these reckless political games. They care about how disastrous a default will be on them in their request to buy a house or lease a car or pay for college. They don't care about this. They care about results. I sit on the Budget Committee and have a front row seat to this nonsense.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
We have to pay our bills, and we have to reject the ransom note.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my colleague. A budget is a vision and a statement of values, and we have received the President's budget. We are conducting oversight. We will be presenting our full 10-year budget resolution, but I can tell you it will be starkly different than the President's and the Democrat Party's vision for America's future. It will not ask for $100 billion more in discretionary spending while American families are struggling to buy groceries and put gas in their cars. It is just so out of touch. We need the kind of leadership that will lean in and say, we are going to be an example, and that we are going to look for the waste, which is not hard to find in this town, and we are going to right the ship and restore fiscal responsibility. And the President also, as part of his value statement, adds trillions of dollars, $65 trillion in taxes over the 10-year horizon, which is the most that any president has ever proposed in the history of our country. He proposes spending to the tune of a quarter of our entire economy, which is the largest economy in the world. That's larger than any year of spending since we invaded Normandy. That's what our president is doing and putting forth as the Democrat Party's vision for this future in the midst of this economy that's struggling, families that are struggling, and a debt crisis that looms large on the horizon. Where is the leadership? I respect my colleagues. I appreciate their friendship, but this is the moment that we have to step up and put our fellow countrymen first and walk in their shoes and not get caught up in trying to protect with a death grip the blank check that we've seen and the endless money that's being printed and borrowed. It will end poorly. We have this window of mercy to act, and we got to act together, ultimately, for this to be sustainable, because this is the first step. It will require many more steps. We didn't get here overnight. We won't get out of it overnight, but we have to take the first step together. I implore my friend, my colleagues, to come with us and do what's been done so many times. That's the thing, Mr. Speaker. 8 of the last most meaningful, most significant fiscal reforms in this Congress came as a result and at the same time we were negotiating a debt ceiling. It's not wild and it's not reckless. It is responsible to do that. You can raise the debt ceiling, you can pay your bills, and you can protect the future for our children. That's leadership, and that's what this country needs in this hour. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, first I want to thank my friend, and truly we have been friends for our entire time of service here. And I respect his sincerity and how committed he is on this issue. But I would say to him, and I hope he will take this under consideration, it is so irresponsible to use the debt ceiling in this way. And here's the analogy. Imagine if, I mentioned 3 times, we raised the debt ceiling with the Republican president. Imagine if in one of those debt ceiling debates, this side of the aisle said, well, we care deeply about raising the minimum wage. Right now, we have the longest period in American history, for as long as the minimum wage has existed, without an increase, about 15 years. What if this side of the aisle said, we're not going to vote for a debt limit increase, we're going to use this as leverage, and in return, you need to raise the minimum wage, or you need to expand Medicare to those 55 and older? That would be irresponsible as well. The debt ceiling is about past spending that both sides often voted for, that presidents of both parties signed into law. Now, if we want to have a conversation about future spending, we welcome that. We will negotiate on that. But we will not negotiate on whether or not America pays its bills, period. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to this regressive, short-sighted, and cruel Default on America Act that will devastate programs that are critical to Oregonians and Americans. We have a housing affordability and homelessness crisis, but this bill would eliminate affordable housing assistance for many families and seniors. Our constituents can't find or afford childcare, but this bill would take away access to Head Start. The cost of higher education keeps rising, but this bill would cut Pell Grants and slash additional funding to support millions of disabled and low-income students. And instead of addressing the climate crisis, this legislation would entrench reliance on fossil fuels, undermine renewable, sustainable energy options, and raise taxes for middle-class Americans. This bill could cause millions of low-income seniors and veterans to lose access to nutrition assistance, and up to 10 million people could lose Medicaid coverage. There's a simple solution to prevent these harmful outcomes. Bring a clean debt ceiling bill to the floor so we can end this MAGA Republican-created manufactured crisis. Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities on how up to 10 million people could be at significant risk of losing health coverage under Speaker McCarthy's bad backward bill. And I yield back.
Objection. Gentleman from Texas, recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me say how blessed I feel to serve alongside my ranking member, and I appreciate his thoughtful comments, and we're gonna do a lot of great things together. I yield now to my friend from Georgia and fellow Budget Committee member for 1 minute, Mr. Buddy Carter.
I thank you, gentlemen, for yielding, and let me begin by thanking leadership and particularly the chair of the Budget Committee for all of their hard work in putting this together. And let me also say that my colleague on the other side of the aisle talks about fiscal irresponsibility. Well, if you want to talk about fiscal irresponsibility, you only need to look at the White House and what this administration has done. Day one, they declared war on fossil fuels. You can make the argument, and a valid argument, that what has happened in our economy is a self-inflicted wound brought about by this war on fossil fuels that caused an increase in gas prices, it caused an increase in inflation, it caused an increase in interest rates, and it put this economy in the shambles that it's in right now. Since the first day of the administration, this Biden administration has recklessly spent taxpayers' dollar, and as a result, as I say, you see inflation at record highs, stealing money and opportunities from hardworking Americans. Our credit cards are maxed out. The gentleman talks about future spending. That's what this is about, limiting future spending. That is the conversation we are having. Mr. Speaker, I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Omar.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. For a long time, Republicans spent so much time saying they were going to address the economic anxiety families were feeling, but overnight they dreamt up a dangerous economic bill that will plunge families into economic depression. Republicans say they want to grow the economy, but their bill will destroy 8,000 jobs in my district alone and 7 million across this country. They say they want to invest in children, but this bill eliminates child care access for 4,000 kids in my state and 180,000 nationwide. They talk nonstop about rail safety, yet in this bill, it would cut at least 160 rail inspection days in Minnesota and cut 7,000 inspections nationwide. They are not repealing the Bush-Trump tax cuts because what their bill is going to do is do wealth transfer from working and middle-class families to billionaires and millionaires. This is hypocrisy and is full of lies. Corporations should not be put ahead of our families.
Texas.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, leadership isn't easy, and boy, does our nation need it right now. I know of such a leader. His name is Steve Scalise. He's our majority leader and a champion for freedom and fiscal responsibility, and I'd be honored to yield a minute to the gentleman from Louisiana.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Texas, not only a leader, but the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Mr. Arrington, for bringing this bill to the floor. Because, Mr. Speaker, we all know our nation's at a crossroads. It's a very fragile time for the American people. They're looking at inflation that's going through the roof, decades high, paying more for everything. And they know why that happened. They're paying more for everything when they go to the grocery store, the gas pump, anywhere else, because Washington has spent trillions of dollars that this country doesn't have. Over the last 2 years, President Biden has maxed out the nation's credit card. That's what the debt ceiling is. That's what this debate is about.
And so as the president has maxed out the nation's credit card, Americans know what that means. They have credit cards. They work hard not to max theirs out. They all know that we're going to make the minimum payment on those cards. But if somebody maxed out the credit card like President Biden did, the first thing you do is not give them another credit card to max out, as President Biden has asked and demanded. He said, just give them more money to keep spending money that we don't have to rack up more inflation on hardworking families. Well, Mr. Speaker, that would be irresponsible. And yet that's what the president has asked for. What House Republicans have done is come together and say there's a better way. Sure, we need to address the debt ceiling, but we also need to address at the same time the problems that have brought us to this moment. It's not by accident that the nation's credit card got maxed out. This is how bad the problem is, because we can talk trillions all day long, and the numbers get so big that people just tune it out. Let's talk some basic numbers. For every $100 that the federal government takes in, the federal government is spending $129. Now, if a family did that, it wouldn't last long before they would go under, before they would lose their house, before they would go bankrupt. $100 coming in and $129 going out. That's the spending problem in Washington. And President Biden said he wants to spend another $129 with $100 still coming in. Most families would look at that and say it's irresponsible to do that. And we agree as House Republicans. Now, you would think the president has acknowledged this finally and said, okay, why don't we sit down at the table and figure this out? We do not need a debt crisis in this nation. But instead of sitting down to negotiate, which is what anybody responsible would do, Speaker McCarthy has said, Mr. President, let's sit down. They did it once over 2 months ago. The president himself, in fact, days later said, you know what, we ought to do it again. The problem is the president then went into hiding. The president will not sit down and meet with the speaker to negotiate how to solve this problem because the president wants to run the clock out and create a debt crisis. That is the height of irresponsibility, Mr. Speaker. And if the president's going to shirk his responsibility and try to hide and just wait until the clock strikes midnight, House Republicans are not going to sit on the sidelines. We're going to lead and present a solution. That's what this bill is. That's what Mr. Arrington's legislation does, Mr. Speaker. It says, as we deal with the debt ceiling, let's also deal with the spending problem that got us here. And how do we do it? I think reading the bill would be real important. We'll send an extra copy down to the White House so that they can actually see some of the basic things we're talking about. And these are things that families get. Right now in America, if you talk to any small business owner, they're all looking for workers. You would think we have full employment. Everybody that wants to work and that's capable of working is working. Unfortunately, that's not the case. President Biden put in place over the last few years different changes to welfare so that people that are fully able-bodied, that aren't even, they're not turning down work, they're not even looking for work, some of them making over $35,000 a year to sit at home, that is costing taxpayers over $100 billion. What we say is frankly a question a lot of people have asked over the years. I'm just going to read it to you as the voters of the state of Wisconsin had presented to them just a few weeks ago, Mr. Speaker. Quote, shall able-bodied, childless adults be required to look for work in order to receive taxpayer-funded welfare benefits? Pretty straightforward question. In fact, 79.5% of Wisconsin voters just a few weeks ago said, yes, they should look for work before they get taxpayer benefits. Should a single mom who's working 2 jobs have to pay for somebody who's sitting at home who just chooses not to work? Look, this is America. If you want to sit at home and not work, that's your prerogative. But should you be asking a hardworking taxpayer to pay for you $35,000 or more a year to sit at home when everybody's looking for workers? And so we say, let's just put those basic work requirements back in place, just like the voters of Wisconsin said a few weeks ago. Now, you would think the White House, that's some kind of far-reaching idea. Most people get this. But this isn't just about saving taxpayer money. It saves a lot of taxpayer money to do this. You know what else it does, Mr. Speaker? Our bill strengthens Social Security because when President Biden is sending tens of billions of dollars every month to pay people not to work, not only are they not working, not only are they eating up all kind of money that our children are ultimately going to have to pay back, they are also taking money out of Social Security because they're not paying into it. By putting these basic work requirements back in place, there's millions of people that are sitting on the sidelines that'll finally get back into the workplace, finally have an opportunity at the American dream again, finally be able to lift their standard of living up. But you know what else they're going to be doing, Mr. Speaker? They're going to be paying into Social Security. They will be paying into Medicare. That will add tens of billions of dollars to strengthen Social Security and Medicare. Why would President Biden be against that? We claw back some of the unspent COVID money. President Biden himself said COVID emergency is over. Yet there's tens of billions of dollars out there being spent on things that have nothing to do with COVID, all under the name of the pandemic. Why not save that money for taxpayers? In addition to saving taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars, we also put in pro-growth policies in this bill. Things like the Lower Energy Costs Act. You talk to families about the things that are angering them that are coming out of Washington. Clearly, inflation, the cost of everything going up, is the biggest item. The biggest item driving inflation is President Biden's anti-American energy policies. Families today are paying 50% more when they go fill up their cars at the pump. 50% more than the day President Biden took office. There's no reason for that. Instead of President Biden getting on Air Force One and going and begging Saudi princes to produce more energy or begging Putin to produce more energy, we can make it here in America cleaner than anywhere else in the world, actually lowering carbon emissions. And yet President Biden keeps saying no to American energy. He says yes to foreign oil, but no to American oil. That doesn't pass the smell test. And in our bill, we actually fix that and allow Americans to produce more energy here, to produce more critical minerals. Why should we be relying on China for computer chips? Over 90% of solar panels in the world are made in China. Why not make more of those things here? Car batteries. They talk about electric cars all day, yet over 90% of the car batteries are made in China because they won't let America access our minerals here, so we become dependent on foreign countries. I'm tired of being dependent on countries like China because President Biden's gotten the policies wrong over and over again. Let's fix this. We do fix these problems in this bill. And if President Biden's got a better idea, it's long past time he puts those ideas on the table. This is not a problem you run and hide from. In fact, when you ask to be President of the United States, you're the commander-in-chief, you're the leader of the free world, Mr. Speaker. This is not a job where you run and hide from the tough things. These are the moments where you step up. You rise to the moment. The American people are calling for us all to do that. And if some people want to sit and hide and hope that the clock strikes midnight and they can just force some bad deal on the taxpayers of America, well, you know, that's what they're sick about Washington over. Time and time again, when Washington doesn't answer the needs of hardworking families who are struggling and just waits until the midnight hour to jam a bad deal down the throats of people. Let's not wait till that midnight hour. We are standing up and leading, and it's long past time that President Biden gets off the sidelines and does his job too and gets to the negotiating table with Speaker McCarthy so we can solve this problem and put America on a stronger financial footing that will benefit all Americans. It's time to end this madness. Let's pass this legislation. Let's start this conversation that families have been having for a long time. It's long past time Washington gets into the middle of this conversation too. Let's pass this bill. Let's solve this problem. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Speaker, listening to all the doom and gloom from the previous speaker, you might forget for a moment that right now in the world, the greatest economic recovery from COVID is that of the United States of America, with the greatest job growth in my lifetime. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1 minute to my friend from California, Mr. Levin.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to remind my colleagues of both parties that the legislation before us could do irreparable harm to our nation's veterans. This bill would force a 22% cut to non-defense spending. That would slash $30 billion from veteran services. And that means 30 million veterans will have fewer health care visits, fewer staff, an increased claims backlog, and longer wait times for benefits. That's the uncertainty that awaits veterans should this bill succeed. Just last month during a committee hearing, my Republican colleagues assured they didn't want to reduce services for veterans. I heard it from them firsthand. So I was so troubled to learn that this bill completely fails to protect veterans from its cuts. And yesterday, 24 veteran and military service organizations sent a letter urging Congress not to pass this legislation. I'm dismayed that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are prepared to force a default and devastate our economy if we don't go along with it. Please don't do this. Don't hold our nation's veterans hostage. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I reserve my time.
Time reserved. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Ms. Craig.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today's debate is perhaps one of the most dangerous games to be perpetrated in my time in Congress by the radical right. This bill risks our economy, our nation's credit rating, American jobs, retirement savings, and health care access. My colleagues, there is a proposal on the table. Raise the debt ceiling. Full stop, just like we did under the former president. And then let's have a robust debate about spending in a budget debate in the appropriations process. But that's not what the radical right has to put on the floor today. I cannot support a bill that would cut funding for our nation's veterans, would cut funding to Minnesota public schools, would cost jobs, and economists say would increase the likelihood of a recession. This is not a serious bill from the radical right, and there is no more serious issue facing our country right now than the prospect of defaulting on our debt. This is a dangerous game my colleagues are playing, and you need to cut it out. I yield.
I reserve my time.
Time reserved. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Maryland, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Trone.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to vote no against the extremist Republicans' default on our debt act. The legislation offered by Speaker McCarthy really begs the question, is this what we stand for? The default on our debt act makes a 22% cut on our education system, our students, our nation's competitiveness. Is this what we stand for? 22% cut in the VA, cut in law enforcement, including health care for America's brave, and state grants fund the prosecution against domestic violence. Is this what we stand for? It makes a 22% cut in special supplemental nutrition program for women and infants that feed 53% of the infants in the U.S. and ensures they have nutritious food to survive. Is this what we stand for? That's certainly not what I stand for, and I plan to vote no on the legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve my time, Mr. Speaker.
Time reserved. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois, distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Schakowsky.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
So I brought my Constitution with me because the Constitution is very clear that it is the duty of the United States of America to pay its debts. And somehow it doesn't say a darn thing about how you can negotiate to hold the whole economy hostage and threaten the economy of the United States of America before you're willing to pay the debts. And, you know, under Trump, I'm sure it was said before, 3 times the debt ceiling was raised. And yet you're saying now, at the same time, Donald Trump gave a $2 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest Americans. But don't blame him for the deficit. Let's talk about these poor people that are trying to get health care or put food on the table for their families, or the veterans who are seeing a cut in their health care. No way. Vote no on this terrible, mean proposal.
Gentlewoman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Time reserved. Gentleman from Texas. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the time remaining?
3 minutes on both sides, sir.
Then, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Panetta.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking member, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you. I rise in opposition to the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. As a member of the Ways and Means and Budget Committees, and as much as I want to take serious steps to lower our debt and deficit, this legislation is not serious, it's not bipartisan, and it leaves us with a partisan hit list. I say that because the way it's written, it would increase hunger and deprive low-income citizens of health care. It would make significant cuts to critical government services that could lead to the loss of 780,000 jobs. It would cut IRS funding needed to close a tax gap and collect taxes owed. It would do nothing to raise revenues, and it would do nothing to find common ground on permitting reform. It would target the cornerstone of the industrial policy that we created last term to lower our carbon output by repealing clean energy tax credits. Solutions to the debt crisis need to be serious, not partisan. But this bill brings us closer to default by demanding partisan policies that will never pass the Senate. I will vote no on this bill, but I do look forward to raising the debt ceiling and then having serious conversations about how we can ensure that Congress gets serious about a solution to our debt and deficit
Gentleman's
reduction.
time's up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I reserve my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
The gentlewoman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania. You know, as my distinguished colleague, Representative Connolly says, representing the state of Maryland, well. Several years ago, we warned during the Trump tax cuts that this dramatic decrease in revenue would explode the nation's debt. And we heard from the Republican side, no, let us write off our yachts, let us write off our private jets. And we said that this decrease in revenue would explode our national debt. But instead now of realizing the error of our ways and reversing these tax cuts for the wealthy, we are now seeing the Republican side promote a bill that cuts student loan cancellation, veterans' health care, cancer research, opioid treatment, Meals on Wheels, and more. The debt limit is about meeting our obligations already voted for, that Republicans and Democrats have already voted for. And if we want to cut and make changes to programming in the future, we may do that. But this and threatening to take the economy is not how we do it. Thank you, and I yield back to the chair.
Gentleman from Texas recognized.
I reserve my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, we have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves.
What do I say? I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. And may I inquire again, sorry, as to the time remaining? Is it 1 minute?
1 minute.
All right. Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman on the other side for this vigorous debate. Again, I would remind all of us about what is involved in the DOA Act. The single biggest cut to non-defense programs in American history. It would, according to Moody's Analytics, lead to 800,000 job losses by the end of 2024 and a dramatically increased likelihood of a recession. It would do absolutely nothing to solve the real problems that we have in our society. Mr. Speaker, this is not good policy for the American people. This will jeopardize the record job growth that we are currently experiencing. I urge all members of this House to make the DOA Act exactly that. DOA, dead on arrival. Vote no. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania. Gentleman from Texas recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank again my ranking member, my friend, my partner in public service. My Democrat colleagues say, let's raise the debt ceiling today and we'll deal with the debt tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes. It never comes. And we're prepared, I guess, to bury our children under the mountain of debt that we've amassed because of a government we think the people want and need. How irresponsible, how reckless, how weak, how cowardice that we won't step up and do the right thing. And I can't believe that the Democrat Party has strayed so far left that ensuring able-bodied people who are receiving public assistance work is an extreme MAGA idea, and that it's radical for people to just rein in spending to just last year's levels of spending. I've heard a lot of fear-mongering, false choices, and phantom funding cuts, all, Mr. Speaker, in an attempt to accept the status quo. Well, here's what the status quo has given us: skyrocketing prices, shrinking paychecks, soaring interest rates, a labor shortage, a culture of dependency, an overall weaker economy, and a more vulnerable nation. To my friends, all of us have contributed to this. I will admit I've conceded that. But we have a moment in time. The hour has come. We have to work together to restore fiscal sanity in this place before it's too late. The consequences of our failure to act, Mr. Speaker, could not be more grave. I'll say it again. We've got to pay our debts. We've got to protect the good faith and credit of the United States. But we cannot give unlimited line of credit to any party, any politician, and allow our country to be bankrupted and to rob our children of the blessings of liberty in this land of opportunity. We shouldn't accept that. We should work together to be responsible, be leaders, leaders worthy of this great nation. So let's vote together in support of H.R. 2811. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman is recognized. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's fiscal crisis, it threatens all Americans. We are here today to debate legislation that accomplishes so much of what the American people want. Specifically, it begins to get Washington's spending habits under control. It starts to slow the flow of special interest handouts to the wealthy and well-connected. And it throws much needed water on the fire of inflation burning through the wallets of American families. Unlike the Inflation Reduction Act, the Limit, Save, Grow Act under consideration today actually does what it says it's going to do. It puts real limits on future spending so that we begin to turn the ship back in a more fiscally sound direction. It saves taxpayer dollars by clawing back unobligated pandemic spending, a sensible solution given the fact that the president himself has declared the pandemic over. It saves taxpayer dollars by ending welfare for the wealthy and loopholes for big corporations in the Inflation Reduction Act. 90% of these special interest green tax breaks go to companies with over $1 billion in sales. Financial institutions alone pocket 3 times as much as any other industry, and these tax dollars are being funneled to China, enriching the Chinese Communist Party and allowing it to dominate critical mineral supply chains. I know my friends on the other side share in frustration in how that law has ended up so different than what they thought they were voting for. In this bill, we propose pro-worker, pro-small business policies like work requirements in our welfare programs that will not only support a more vibrant economy, but also help more Americans realize the dignity of work. This plan will also take the target off the backs of low and middle income taxpayers under threat from a supercharged army of 87,000 at the IRS. The Biden administration brags about the $400 billion in revenues they plan to bring in by unleashing the new agents. To do that, audit rates will have to go up on low and middle income Americans. In fact, under the so-called historical audit rate the administration says it will adhere to, we will see a million new audits, with 650,000 of them falling on folks who make less than $75,000 or less. I find it curious to hear my Democrat colleagues and the president say they will not negotiate on spending when it comes to the debt ceiling, while at the same time complaining there's no plan over which to negotiate. Well, here you go. Republicans have a plan. It is time for the president to negotiate over spending reforms as part of addressing the debt ceiling, just as we have done many times before. In fact, just as the president himself has done many times before as a senator and as vice president. 11 of the previous debt ceiling increases going back decades have included fiscal reforms. President Biden voted for such agreements as a senator, and he negotiated them as a vice president. The president's current position of refusing to discuss common sense spending restraints when it comes to the debt ceiling is a reckless abandonment of past precedent and in his own history. Under one-party Democrat rule, we got $10 trillion in new spending. The consequences have been very real. Since President Biden took office, we've seen a spike in prices by 14.9%. Real wages have declined by 3.5%. And interest rates, they've increased more in the past year than the prior 15 years combined. The American people, they are demanding something to be done about all of this. Let's pass this legislation and put the interest of workers, families, farmers, and small businesses first and foremost. Let's do as Congress has done before and address the debt ceiling with policies that also address the Washington spending habits that got us here. I reserve the balance of my time.
Balance of the time. The gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I might consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the Default on America's Act. The chairman just mentioned something that is noteworthy. He said, we are seeing a Republican plan, and for the next hour, we intend to make sure America gets a chance to see the Republican plan. A reminder for those who might be paying attention to this debate today as to how we traveled on this road, which, by the way, is imminently manageable through negotiation after a clean debt ceiling vote might take place. So our Republican colleagues, I think, I might be mistaken, you know what, I'm sure, they voted for more defense spending. $800 billion we are now at with defense spending. So they voted for pandemic relief. They voted for aid to Ukraine. How about the 1.5 million new veterans that we have in America in the aftermath of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan? They deserve our care. And our Republican colleagues voted for that aid. So the Republican members, some of whom voted for the infrastructure bill, some of them who voted for the legislation on Inflation Reduction Act and some of them who voted for the CHIPS Act. That's what's in front of us at this moment. But here's the real ringer, Mr. Speaker. In December of 2017, and I hope everybody pays attention to this argument, they voted to borrow $2.3 trillion over 10 years for the purpose of giving a tax cut to the wealthiest among us, with, by the way, modest to limited economic growth. So why is that important? Because there's been $10 trillion worth of tax cuts over the last 25 years. You want me to recite it? How about President Bush's tax cut in 2001? $1.3 trillion. But came back in 2003 and another trillion. And subsequently presided over the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, which we should note the cost of which are in the trillions of dollars today. So they want us to believe that this problem that we have in front of us, as which I have mentioned, is manageable. They want us to believe that this is a Democratic position on spending after they embraced the tax cuts that I've just described. This is about America's credit. Whatever happened to the Republican Party that talked about probity as it related to financial stability? Whatever happened to the Republican Party that talked about the importance of investment? These arguments that they make now are largely vacuous because it's inconsistent with the Republican Party I knew when I came to Congress. So they could borrow money for the Iraq War month after month to keep it off budget so nobody would see what it was really about. And they could borrow money repeatedly, and the minute a Democrat gets to the White House, they're blamed for inflation. I don't think Joe Biden should be blamed for inflation in the United Kingdom. Or how about Germany? That's how empty these arguments are that they're making. There's a chance for us to do what we used to do here. And by the way, Democrats responsibly voted for raising the debt ceiling 3 times under the former president because we thought it was the responsible thing to do. So Speaker McCarthy got himself into this by the promises that he made along the way. The suggestion here is very simple, Mr. Speaker. Pass a clean debt ceiling, and then let's get on with negotiating. Bill Clinton on January 19th of 2001 had balanced the budget 4 times. 4 times. Projected surpluses in the trillions of dollars and 22 million new jobs. And the Republican Party gave it away through tax cuts to wealthy people. And they're asking us today the following. Okay, so they get to set the fire and then call the fire department? Because that's what this argument is about. And with that, I hold on to the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's reserved. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, Mr. Boss from Illinois.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there's a lot of talk on this floor and actually outside the chambers today from the other side of the aisle about this bill cutting veterans. Well, I'm going to tell you, as the only veteran amongst the 4 VA committee leaders responsible for ensuring veterans have the care and services they've earned, and as a father of a veteran, and a grandfather of a veteran, and a grandson of a veteran, and a son of a veteran, and a nephew of a veteran, you better believe that I'm dead serious that we're not cutting veterans, and I mean it. Now, I don't know how much clearer we can be. Speaker McCarthy has been very clear. We're not cutting veterans. Chairwoman Granger, we're not cutting veterans. And I, as the chairman of the Veterans Committee, we're not cutting veterans. The House, the White House, and Democrats know. And we can get our physical house in order while ensuring our service members and veterans are taken care of. And yet, with no regard for the impact of their words, they continue to speak lies about how House Republicans are cutting veterans' benefits, and it's false. And it is dangerous rhetoric. Dangerous rhetoric, and you ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Simply put, you're placing politics and playing politics with our veterans. and their lives and their concerns. Veterans are not political pawns to advance an agenda. CBO says that the Limited Save Growth Act will grow the economy and save American taxpayers money, which is a good thing. Because at the end of the day, our veterans, you know what, they're taxpayers too. And their grandmothers and mothers and their grandfathers and their fathers. And you know what? They're concerned about their children and grandchildren. So if you believe in building America that is worth our veterans' selfless sacrifice, I urge you to stop playing politics. Come to the table and support the bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My point was and is Republicans voted for the PATH Act, as we did. Bill is due. With that, let me call upon the distinguished minority leader in the House of Representatives, a champion of long-term worthwhile investments, Hakeem Jeffries.
Does the gentleman yield 1 minute?
Long 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Neal, for your extraordinary leadership and continuing to work to elevate values that benefit everyday Americans. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the extreme MAGA Republican Default on America Act. This reckless Republican effort to lead us down the road of a dangerous default will hurt working families, hurt the middle class, hurt all those Americans who aspire to be part of the middle class, hurt young people, hurt seniors, hurt veterans, hurt the poor, the sick, and the afflicted, hurt people in urban America, in rural America, in exurban America, in small-town America, in Appalachia, in the heartland of America, hurt the least, the lost, and the left behind. The extreme MAGA Republican Default on America Act will hurt everyday Americans. Why? Because you want to jam your reckless, extreme ideology down the throats of the American people in a hostage-taking situation. Instead of producing a budget, that's what President Biden has done. You've produced a ransom note. The Default on America Act is a ransom note because effectively what you are saying is pass our extreme MAGA Republican bill or else America is going to default. Now we have a responsibility here in the United States Congress to uphold the full faith and credit of the United States of America, to make sure that as a country we pay our bills, bills that have already been incurred, not default. And that's what our responsibility is, not as Democrats or as Republicans, as Americans. That's why in the previous administration, Democrats 3 times worked with the Trump administration to avoid a default. No gamesmanship, no brinksmanship, no partisanship. Work with the previous administration, to which we disagreed often, to make sure that America paid its bills. Notwithstanding the fact that in our 247-year history, 25% of America's debt was accumulated during the 4 years of the Trump administration. But we did our patriotic responsibility to make sure that America would not default on our debt. But now, with a different president in office, you want to play games. You want to flirt with a default. Take us down this dangerous path. And you claim it's all about fiscal responsibility. Give me a break. That's rhetoric. That's not what the record shows. As Mr. Neal articulated, this is not about fiscal responsibility. That's rhetoric. What the record shows is that Democrats are the party of job creation and fiscal responsibility, and Republicans have been the party of tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected, and exploding deficits. Bill Clinton inherited deficits from the previous two administrations. 20 million good-paying jobs were created during the 8 years of the Clinton presidency, and he eliminated the deficit. In fact, he created a budget surplus. President Barack Obama inherited the Great Recession, fiscal irresponsibility, and 14 million good-paying private sector jobs were created during the presidency of Barack Obama, and he reduced the deficit by $1 trillion, took it from 1.5 trillion to 500 billion. Democrats, the party of job creation and fiscal responsibility. Joe Biden inherited a mess. And what did he do? In 2 years, more than 10 million jobs created. Now that number over 12 million. And reduced the deficit by $1.7 trillion. What's the Republican record? Why do you lecture America about fiscal responsibility? Mr. Speaker, what is the Republican record? President Reagan comes into office, and the first thing that he does is massive tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected, and explodes the deficit. President George W. Bush comes into office, 2001, 2003, massive tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected, 2 failed wars, a deep recession, explodes the deficit. President Trump comes into office. First thing he does in 2017, massive tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. The GOP tax scam. 83% of the benefits going to the wealthiest 1% in America, explodes the deficits. How dare you lecture America about fiscal responsibility when the record shows that Democrats are the party of job creation and reducing deficits, and Republicans are the party of tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected, and exploding the deficit. So we're not going to stand here and allow you to lecture us about fiscal responsibility. What this is an effort to try to extract deep, painful cuts on everyday Americans. There's a process for America to pay its bills. It should be seamless. And then there's a budget process and an appropriations process. That's where we can have a conversation about future spending, future investments. What should the priorities be? President Joe Biden produced a budget. His budget will actually protect and strengthen Social Security, build an economy that works for everyday Americans, and cut the deficit by $3 trillion. We've been asking for a Republican budget. Instead of you giving us a budget, you've given us a ransom note. That's what the Default on America Act is, threatening a dangerous default. Pass it or else. That's not statesmanship, that's brinksmanship. And it will cause grave harm to everyday Americans. The reckless Republican, extreme MAGA Republican, dangerous default effort risks triggering a painful recession that will cost millions of good-paying jobs. This reckless Republican effort, this effort to lead us down a dangerous default, will risk crashing the stock market and put in jeopardy the retirement security of millions of older Americans. This reckless Republican effort to lead us down a dangerous default risks exploding costs for everyday Americans. That's what's in front of us right now. That's why we oppose this reckless effort to default on America. This bill is unacceptable, it's unreasonable, it's unworkable, it's unconscionable, and it's un-American. That's why we oppose it. That's why we're urging vote no. And that's why we're asking you to come together, not as Republicans, but as Americans, to do what has always been done and make sure America pays bills that have already been incurred and avoid a dangerous default. I yield back.
Chair would like to remind members to, in the interest of the proper decorum in the House, to address the chair. Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot of comments just recently about tax provisions that help the wealthy, the well-off, and well-connected. Let's point out the Democrats' tax policies that we are ripping out from the roots that are helping the wealthy, well-off, and well-connected. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to submit for the record analysis from the Joint Committee on Taxation showing that big corporations with more than $1 billion in sales receives over 90%. Over 90% of all special interest electricity subsidies, and that financial institutions receive 3 times more benefit from these tax credits than any other industry, where the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected benefit. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my good friend from Missouri. And right now, I'd like to yield to the gentlewoman from Virginia and fellow Navy veteran for the purpose of colloquy.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for yielding. I strongly agree with him that Washington's excessive spending, Republicans are ready to lead the way to end the era of reckless government spending. After only 2 years under the Biden administration, our federal deficit has grown by over $6 trillion. This is unacceptable for our country, but especially for our children who will inherit this deficit. But I also agree that our great nation cannot default on our debts, and this bill, like all others, must be paid. I support lifting the debt ceiling, but only if coupled with reforms to Washington's wasteful spending in order to repair the inflation crisis and strengthen America's economy. While the president has offered no plan to avoid default, I'm proud to be a part of this new Republican majority that has put forward the Limit, Save, and Grow Act, which proposes solutions. That being said, I do have serious concerns with the provisions of this legislation that repeals clean energy investment tax credits, particularly for wind energy. These credits have been very beneficial to my constituents, attracting significant investment and new manufacturing jobs for businesses in Southeast Virginia. The energy production happening in my district will incentivize clean energy solutions here in America and provide jobs for Virginians and energy options for military installations in my district. For all these reasons, I do not support the repeal of these clean energy tax credits. I recognize that this bill is not the final product, but I also understand that it gets us to the negotiating table. I worked hard for a new Republican majority to have a seat at that table. My ask is for the gentleman's assurance that I will be able to address these concerns as we move forward in these negotiations and advocate for the interests of my district.
Well, I want to thank the gentlewoman for her remarks and for working with us on this bill. I'd like the gentlewoman to know that I support repealing these tax credits, but I understand the gentlewoman's concern.
Yield another 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. And of course, we'll continue to work with the gentlewoman from Virginia, just like we will with all members, on making sure we're paying our nation's debt ceiling, we're lifting our debt ceiling, but doing it in a responsible, reasonable, and sensible manner, and bringing Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden to the negotiation table.
Thank you. I have full faith that we can negotiate a final debt ceiling deal that both restores fiscal responsibility and empowers Americans to be good stewards of our nation's vast natural resources. Again, I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Thank you. And I yield back to the gentleman from Missouri.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentlelady from Virginia for calling attention to these tax credits. And you talk about fortuitous timing. Here is the author of those tax credits, all $370 billion, along with Earl Blumenauer, and we intend to lay out where these tax credits are going to Republican districts and see if those members wish to take advantage of those tax credits or not. And a veteran on top of that, our friend, Congressman Thompson, for 1 minute.
Gentleman
Thank you,
from
Mr.
California is
Chairman.
recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the Default on America Act. Mr. Speaker, we need to raise the debt ceiling, not because of money we want to spend in the future, but because of money that we've already spent. Both parties have contributed to our current debt, including over $2 trillion of debt caused by the 2017 Republican tax bill, and hundreds of billions in COVID relief spending voted for by both parties and signed into law by a Republican president. A quarter of our nation's debt was racked up during the previous administration. And now Republicans are trying to use our obligation to pay our debts as a leverage point to kick millions of people off of health care insurance, to defund the biggest investment in climate change in our country's history, and make it harder for the neediest among us to feed themselves. Let's be clear. If we default on our debt, the consequences will be felt by every American. We have repeatedly passed a clean debt ceiling bill, and we need to do that today. It's time to stop playing games with our debt and end this attack on the stability of the American economy.
Gentleman from Missouri.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Speaker. I rise today in support of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. Every time I talk about debt, deficit, spending, budget, anything, I think about my 4 boys. They're 10 and under. And I bring it up a lot, and I use it in so many different ways. It drives what I do. It gets me out of bed every single day to be working on this. And I just can't hear one more time, well, let's just raise the debt ceiling, and then let's get to work on this. It's no longer time for that. We cannot accept not to use every single opportunity that we have back here in Congress to address this. I've sat on the sidelines, I'm second term in Congress, I've sat on the sidelines and I've watched us constantly do this over and over again, and I want to see something substantive happen here. That's what we're doing here today, Speaker. We are trying to do something substantive. We learned we have debt that exceeds $30 trillion. The optimism of our future depends on what we do over the next 10 years. We've learned that empires that overextend themselves like we have done, the outcome is not good. But America's done this before, and we are at an inflection point. Our debt to GDP is where it was right after the World War II. And for the bulk of this 20th century, we were able to get our debt to GDP down. And we have to take action, and we have to do it now. So let's use this opportunity like we've done over the last 30 or 40 years. When there's a debt ceiling increase that comes up, let's take advantage of this. Let's find a way to reduce our spending. That is the best way to address our debt to GDP ratio, and I know everybody in this chamber understands that. So we have an opportunity. This spring is our moment again to stop debt fuel spending sprees that give our children a fair shot at success and not a mountain of IOUs. This act saves $4.8 trillion. It grows our economy and our workforce, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now a pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Massachusetts, the minority whip and a great talent in the Democratic Party, Catherine Clark.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for yielding. I rise in strong opposition to this reckless Default on America Act. I've got to say, I see why the Republicans put this together in the dead of night. I wouldn't want Americans to see this plan either. It's the same GOP playbook. Give more to the rich and elite, stick hardworking Americans with the bill, and threaten economic disaster if we don't go along. So why exactly is the GOP endangering American livelihoods? So they can help a few rich friends dodge their taxes. And what's the cost to the American people? Here's just a few. 2,400 Border Patrol agents off the job, 300,000 kids out of childcare, 400,000 families evicted from their homes, 1 million seniors kicked off of Meals on Wheels, $2 billion taken away from veterans' health care. That is 30 million doctors' appointments stolen from veterans. It is disgraceful. Mr. Speaker, there is one responsible path forward, a clean, unconditional vote to avoid default, something the GOP did 3 times under Donald Trump. As Trump put it himself, we cannot use the debt ceiling to negotiate. Stop the madness, deliver a resounding no vote on this dangerous piece of political theater. I yield back.
From Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of the Republicans' plan to avoid a federal default, to rein in spending, and to get our economy back on track, the Limit, Save, Grow Act. Over the last 2 years, Democrats' out-of-control spending has drastically and dramatically increased our 10-year spending trajectory. That includes the $2 trillion misnamed American Rescue Plan that ignited the highest rise in consumer prices and inflation in 40 years. Americans are paying the price for this radical spending that completely bloated our federal spending. House Republicans, we're committed to finding a sensible debt ceiling solution that will strengthen the American economy, protect American families, and save taxpayers over $4 trillion over the next 10 years. The Limit, Save, Grow Act will do the following. It will limit Washington's irresponsible spending. It will save taxpayers' dollars. It will grow the American economy. House Republicans, we're the only ones who have actually put forward a plan that will keep our federal government from defaulting. It's time for President Biden to come to the table and negotiate. And I urge all my colleagues to support this important legislation that will help families, businesses, and farmers in West Tennessee and across the nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A longtime observer and critic of Republican spending plans in the House is the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, whom I recognize for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I oppose this Republican Default on America Act because it will create more deficits for millions of Americans, an educational opportunity deficit for the students that are relying on Pell Grants, seeing them slashed and their hope for debt forgiveness dashed. It would create an educational opportunity deficit for the children that are denied preschool. Though our Central Texas Food Bank is already overwhelmed, another deficit with more hunger. Also, rent assistance cut for 40,000 Texans as we have an affordability crisis. And perhaps the biggest deficit of all out of this bill, their failure to address the climate crisis. Once merely ignoring science as climate deniers, they have become now destroyers of even the most modest measures to address the climate crisis and incentivize renewable energy, create new jobs, and lower energy costs. Instead, they promote more fossil fuels and more fossilized thinking. For the health of Americans, the health of our economy, and the health of our planet, reject this fraudulent bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the last time the U.S. debt held by the public equaled our total economic output was just after World War II. After that, economic policies, fiscal policies that put our country on the right track resulted in decades of American prosperity and American leadership across the world. Today, the trajectory is far different, as shown on this chart. Our debt to GDP ratio, the best economic measure to show the health of our economy, is projected to go up from 98% today to 118% in the next 10 years and double our economy in just the next 30 years. All I hear from Democrats today is pass a clean debt ceiling. Does anyone on their side care about this trajectory, which will end in disaster? The president certainly has no plan to reduce our debt. He refuses to even negotiate or to acknowledge our debt challenges. The Republican plan today, which I'm proud to support, is the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. This bill will rescind unspent COVID-19 funds, reverse Democrats' inflationary Green New Deal corporate welfare policies while allowing for responsible 1% annual increases in discretionary spending so Americans can continue to invest in core functions of government. All in all, the bill will reduce, as seen in this line, future debt growth by $5 trillion over the next 10 years and begin to decrease our projected debt-to-GDP ratio by 12 points over the next 10 years. Growing our GDP is the second part of the equation. To boost economic growth, the bill includes reforms to unleash domestic energy production and implements pro-growth work requirements that will strengthen our recovering labor force. This bill alone, as can be seen in this chart, is not enough to solve our nation's fiscal issues, but it is a very important first step towards getting our debt to GDP on a descending trajectory. It will begin to bend the curve. I call on the President to negotiate in good faith with Republicans to raise the debt ceiling and put forward policies to limit, save, and to grow. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 1 minute, who had a profound impact on writing the tax credits that the gentlelady from Virginia a moment ago acknowledged. Mr. Blumenauer.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy. You know, there are some shared goals here. I listened carefully to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Ending welfare for the wealthy. Helping people realize the dignity of work. There are ways we can come together to do that. But let's not do it by making it harder for poor people to get food. You want to end welfare for fairway farmers. There's no recognition that people who get these lavish subsidies actually are on the farm and working. There were almost 20,000 farmers who got payments averaging $1 million a year for 37 consecutive years. Let's cap and limit those lavish subsidies. Let's require people who get them to work on the farm. Let's have some limits, not poor people seeking food, but fairway farmers and those who are benefiting from these lavish expenditures. We can do better.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to submit for the record this JCT analysis from 2022 suggesting that the total costs of the special interest tax credits for the rich in the Inflation Reduction Act would be $271 billion. I'd also like to submit for the record yesterday's CBO score, which shows that the cost has more than doubled to $570 billion, and it's growing every day. The wealthy and politically connected corporations will receive hundreds of billions of dollars more than advertised. I yield 2 minutes to the gentle lady from New York.
Without objection, the gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Limit, Save, Grow Act, which addresses the current debt limit crisis while prioritizing responsible spending practices. Critically, this bill will lead to over $4.5 trillion with a T in taxpayer savings over the next decade and reverse a dangerous trend of reckless fiscal mismanagement on the part of the Democrats. Americans and New Yorkers, where I hail from, are facing a fiscal crisis due to a persistently high inflation, rising interest rates, and debt at unsustainable levels. This is a direct result of the trillions upon trillions of dollars that the Democrats have spent since President Biden took office in January 2021, and also a fact, my former colleague from the New York State Assembly, now minority leader here, should know that 40% of our nation's debt was incurred under the leadership of the former speaker, who the minority leader described as the best speaker of all time. Well, he should know the state of New York has the highest taxes, the highest spend rate, the highest corporate welfare, and the highest outmigration of people and jobs in the entire nation. Americans and New Yorkers are facing a fiscal crisis. Instead of politicizing the impending debt limit predicament, Democrats should prioritize responsible spending and work with House Republicans on a solution to reduce reckless spending, save taxpayer money, and grow our economy. It's time for President Biden to come to the negotiating table and work with House Republicans on a path forward to economic stability and growth. And please don't mimic the model that New York has set, where we once had 45 representatives in the 1960s down to 26. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back. I urge all my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, a champion of Medicare, Social Security, and renewable energy.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. For months, the other side have been held our economy hostage. Today, we have their ransom demands. This ripoff kills millions of jobs, guts working family benefits, and sabotages tax fairness. Now, both sides are, many times I've listened today, saying the same thing, reading off the same page. Somebody can't, they all can't be right. So look at the facts. This is not about deficits. This shakedown lets wealthy tax cheats off scot-free and balloons the deficit by $120 billion. Please respond to that. $120 billion deeper in debt. Do not fall for this total sham. Today's smorgasbord of policy goals is a cynical distraction from the horrifying impacts of this extortion. Social Security, Medicare, Veterans Care, home ownership, that's what's at stake, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry to say, we've come to this. Thank you.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to submit for the record this article detailing how Ford is using a loophole in the IRA to partner with CATL, a major Chinese battery company, on a project intended to harvest EV battery tax credits. Chinese companies are lining up to cash in on Democrats' green corporate welfare that we are rescinding in this bill.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I reserve.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Davis, who's been a leader in terms of adoption opportunities for those outside the mainstream.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brinksmanship is no way to run a government. The Default of America Act is one of the worst bills I've had the opportunity to vote on. It is anti-children, anti-seniors, anti-veterans, anti-middle America, anti-small business, anti-health care, anti-workers. As a matter of fact, it is anti-American because all that it does is cut, cut, cut. And when all that you do is cut, cut, and cut, all that you get is blood, blood, blood. And the blood of the American people will be on the hands of those who held the knife. I urge a no vote and yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri.
A gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Washington, one of the most talented members of this institution, Congresswoman Del Bene.
Gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today against this Republican ruse, the Default on America Act. This legislation is not a serious proposal. It's a mega wish list that demands a 22% cut of essential federal programs that support working families, seniors, veterans, public safety, schools, and housing assistance. If passed, this bill would cost an estimated 780,000 jobs, many in the clean energy sector, all across this country. What we need is simple: a clean bill to avoid a default, to ensure we protect the full faith and credit of the United States. If my Republican colleagues want to show Americans they can govern, then pass a clean bill and show us your budget, a real budget, like the president's released. Every day Republicans wait brings us closer to brinksmanship and hurts the American people and the global economy. I urge my colleagues to reject this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 2 minutes in revising and extending my remarks.
Gentleman is recognized.
America's fiscal trajectory is unsustainable. The threat of a potential U.S. government debt default plays into China's long-standing grand strategy for expanding its global role and diminishing our influence. It's a matter of national security to get this under control. When small businesses and families in my district and all across the country experience financial problems, they tighten their belts, they change their spending habits, and they expect Washington to do the same. But instead, President Joe Biden stood in this very chamber, gaslighted, fear-mongered, and claimed Republicans want to sunset Social Security and Medicare, while there are attacks on Republicans all over the country on this very same lie. Why? To frighten seniors and hope the stampede would block Republicans from reining in his destructive runaway spending. That's why I introduced the Protecting Social Security and Medicare Act the very next day. I spoke with leadership in the following weeks about taking these very important, critical programs off the negotiation table, and that's exactly what leadership did. As we debate today, seniors can rest assured that the promises Republicans made to them will not be broken in this debate. I'm also voting for this bill because it does not include cuts to the Pentagon's budget, particularly to Selfridge Air National Guard Base, a pillar of my district, a crown jewel of the state of Michigan, and critical to our national defense against northern aggressors like China, Russia, and North Korea who may threaten us from abroad. It is reasonable to disagree with any specific debt ceiling approach, and I'm looking forward to continuing the debate. But if President Biden continues to refuse to come to the table and negotiate in good faith, we will achieve a historic default, putting our country's national security and families like mine and yours at economic risk in the future. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask permission to insert into the record a letter from Mr. Pasquale for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. With that, let me yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Congressman Beyer, whose knowledge of economics is second to none in this institution.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose the Default on America Act. America always pays its bills. It is important that we have serious negotiations and that we take responsible action to address our continuing deficits. $31 trillion in public debt is a frightening number. But it's a debt we accumulated over Republican and Democratic presidents, Republican and Democratic Congresses, 2 unpaid-for wars, major tax cuts, and costly increases in health care. But it's reckless and irresponsible to use the alleged leverage of a national default to address our debt. First, because the leverage is imaginary. This bill is dead on arrival in the Senate. And second, the leverage already exists. Kevin McCarthy is Speaker. The Republicans have a 222 to 213 majority in the House. The last thing we want to do is plunge our nation into the threat of a default or an actual default. The responsible thing to do is to pass this clean debt ceiling relief and move on to the appropriations process where the debt can be properly addressed. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts with 15½ minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, whose city is home to some of the most important retirement plan management opportunities in all of America.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise and strongly oppose this bill. It would hurt families. It would hurt seniors. It would hurt workers. We must uphold rather than undermine our country's strong economy recovery and standing. We're here to govern. That means paying for what Congress has already approved. We cannot default on the national debt. The only way to cleanly raise the debt ceiling is so right now, I'm saying to you, Mr. Speaker, we are ready. We need to raise the debt. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Missouri with 9 minutes remaining.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, individual who is well known for his proficiency in accounting procedures, Mr. Schneider, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to this unserious bill that cuts life-saving and life-sustaining programs, hurts our economy, and guts historic action on climate change, and needlessly adds to our deficit by carving out loopholes for the wealthy. The Republican cut, slash, and shrink Default on America bill will devastate America. First, it gets the landmark Inflation Reduction Act, which is not only addressing inflation, but is the largest ever effort in our nation's history to combat climate change and lower the cost of prescription drugs. Second, it grows the already large tax gap and irresponsibly adds to the deficit. The bill, seemingly with bad intention, guts tools at the IRS to be both more responsive to responsible taxpayers and stronger in the face of wealthy tax cheats. Finally, this bill would make extreme cuts to discretionary spending, cuts that could amount to as much as 59% by the year 2025. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask that I include for the record this report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, roundup and analyzing Speaker McCarthy's harmful debt ceiling and cuts bill.
Without objection. Gentleman from Missouri.
Reserve.
Reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to the very capable gentleman from Nevada, Congressman Horsford.
Gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal, for the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today for my constituents in Nevada, my Democratic colleagues here in the House, and as chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus to address the latest attempt by extremist MAGA Republicans to put politics over the American people and to put billionaires and corporations over working families and children. Just last week, Speaker McCarthy introduced the Default on America Act that would tank our economic recovery and sabotage job growth, underscoring Republicans' lack of interest in governing for anyone besides the wealthy and the powerful. Speaker McCarthy and his MAGA extremists are demanding that Congress leave programs like SNAP, nutrition programs for seniors and children, at the expense of the wealthy. Everyday cost on families like car payments, student loans, credit card bills, and mortgage payments would increase. In fact, their plan, Default on America, would affect veterans, seniors, families, people, and jobs, including 7,000 in my state alone. I urge my colleagues to vote against this Default on America and to put people over politics.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Missouri.
I reserve.
Reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to one of the most capable people that I've had a chance to serve with in Congress, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland
for yielding
is
1 minute.
recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding 1 minute. Maybe I can get another. I missed the magic minute, as all of you know, because this is not enough time to debate this issue. But something that is as bad as fiscal responsibility is fiscal demagoguery. The Speaker of this House has said default is not an option. 84 of the Republicans in this House have never voted to extend the debt limit. So that default would have been inevitable. That's what this is about, trying to make some sort of deal. I urge my Republican colleagues to follow what they know to be the only rational alternative, and that is vote for a debt extension. Pay our bills. America does not welch on its debts. You believe that, we believe that. 84 of your members have not believed that, but we have a majority of this House that believes it. Stop creating the, may I have one additional? Got it?
The gentleman has yielded an additional half minute.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized
Stop
for an additional 30
this
seconds.
lack of confidence in this body to be fiscally responsible. Let me repeat that. Stop allowing no confidence in this body's ability and willingness to be fiscally responsible. Vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, let me yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Congressman Pallone, who comes from the last two members of the class of 1988, a very talented lot. Mr. Pallone.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my colleague from the same class, the ranking member. Mr. Speaker, House Republicans are manufacturing a crisis to justify cruel cuts that will raise costs for American families, kick millions of people off their health insurance, and reverse the historic progress we've made in combating the worsening climate crisis. The Republicans' Default on America Act cuts $100 billion from Medicaid, which will have devastating consequences on every beneficiary, provider, and plan. The Republicans' Medicaid work requirements are about one thing: stripping health care away from vulnerable people. The majority of adults on Medicaid are already working, oftentimes in part-time jobs that do not offer health care coverage. And those who are not are often dealing with caregiving responsibilities, physical or mental health issues, or experiencing other barriers to employment. These Republican cuts are not about jobs. They're a Trojan horse intended to use red tape and onerous paperwork to kick millions of people off their health insurance simply because Republicans have always opposed Medicaid. Republicans also oppose our efforts to outcompete the world in the transition to a clean energy economy. The Default on America Act continues the Republican polluters over people agenda. The bill repeals key climate provisions that Democrats delivered with the Inflation Reduction Act last year that are already making a huge difference in the clean energy transition. Since its passage, we've seen about $28 billion in new domestic manufacturing investments. Companies have announced $242 billion in new clean power capital investments, and more than 142,000 clean energy jobs have been created across this nation. These are impressive results in less than a year, and yet House Republicans now want to reverse this progress with a grab bag of big oil giveaways and loopholes. Mr. Speaker, this is a dangerous bill that's going to strip health care away from millions of Americans and undermine our efforts to combat the worsening climate crisis. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a March 8, 2021 Politico article titled "Biden's Welfare Flip-Flop," which points out that President Biden was once an ardent supporter of common-sense welfare reforms, including work requirements. Biden was one of 24 Democrat senators who voted for the 1996 welfare reform bill that President Bill Clinton signed. That bill imposed time limits and work requirements for welfare recipients. In fact, Biden's deputy chief of staff was a key architect of the 1996 welfare reform bill and helped coin Clinton's pledge to end welfare as we know it.
Without objection on the request.
And I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, might I inquire as to how much time remains?
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 9.5 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Missouri has 8.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to the very distinguished and capable gentleman from Georgia, Congressman Scott.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. And I want to stand here and make a passionate plea to my Republican friends. Yes, we got to pay our debt, but we do not need to deal with this and putting it on the backs of the poor, our children, our veterans. Ladies and gentlemen, food now is a national security area. But if we incorporate getting food to our veterans, when 11.7% of our veterans live in food-scarce communities and households. Let me just say and sum it up in the words that if Caesar was here, he would say the words that he said to Brutus. Brutus, yours is the meanest cut of all. If we all put this on the backs of our children, our grandchildren, our seniors, and our veterans, I plead with you, in the words of Caesar and God Almighty.
Gentleman's time is
because
expired.
If we do not,
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
It's ungodly.
Excuse me, gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a New York Times article titled "Poverty Plunging from September 14th, 2022, which found that child poverty in the U.S. has fallen by more than half, 59%, since the early 1990s, when President Clinton signed the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill implementing time limits and work requirements. The far left predicted terrible effects. 25 years later, these predictions have been proven wrong. The simple fact is work requirements worked. Caseloads dropped and families moved into the workforce and left the cycle of dependency. Reserved.
Without objection, gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman for acknowledging the role that the child tax credit played in that statistical analysis. And with that, let me yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a new and very capable member of this House, Congressman Goldman.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the ranking member. Last week, Speaker McCarthy came to my district to speak at the New York Stock Exchange to give a speech about this proposed Default on America Act. He threatened the nation with economic catastrophe if we do not bend to the draconian cuts to spending for services that are essential to lifting up working and middle-class Americans. The DOA doesn't touch the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy. It doesn't touch defense spending. Instead, it solely targets domestic spending that hundreds of millions of Americans depend on. An average cut of about 22% on those programs. And in my district alone, which is in New York City, there are more than 200,000 people who rely on Medicaid who will be at risk of losing their coverage. In my district, there are 31 public housing NYCHA complexes that are crumbling and rely on funds from HUD just to maintain their poor condition, and that those would be slashed. This is not a theoretical discussion. This will do real and devastating harm to people in my district and around the country, and we must not pass it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentle lady from New York.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of this legislation. I hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talking about our children, our grandchildren, our future. And if they truly care about the next generation, they would support this measure as well. Because the reality is we cannot continue down the path that we're on. Right now, we are seeing Republicans take over this House from a body that, with complete control with the president, chose the Democrats to add $10 trillion in new spending in just 2 years. Today, we are facing a debt-to-GDP ratio of 121%, completely unsustainable. When I was born in 1980, it was 35%. And the debt at that time was $900 billion. Today, it's $31.4 trillion. And yet all we hear from the other side is that they want to spend more, they want to tax more, they want to create more programs to make people dependent, instead of giving people the opportunity to determine their own future and to live the American dream. We are talking about legislation on our side that will save the American taxpayer $4.5 trillion. Hardworking people, each and every day, they get up, they go to work, they sacrifice tremendously, some working 2 or 3 jobs, and they pay taxes to the government so they can be responsible with it, not throwing it around on all sorts of stuff that we don't need, such as COVID funds that have gone unspent. We just came out of a hearing in COVID subcommittee where we talked about in just education, $190 billion that was earmarked to reopen our schools, which they didn't use to reopen our schools, and then 15% of it was only spent as of November. We're talking about saving the taxpayers $30 to $60 billion right there, $50 to $60 billion right there, just by reclaiming those funds. Biden's IRS army, This is what the other side proposes. How they want to tax people more. They want to take more of the hard-earned taxpayers' money. That's how they plan on paying down our debt, not by having pro-growth policies that stimulate our economy, that help us grow, help companies expand so they can create more jobs. No, they don't want pro-growth policies that are good and for prosperity for our country. They want to continue to hammer people and continue to tax them, nickel and dime them at each and every turn. By just repealing the IRS army, $71 billion right there. What about the Green New Deal tax credits? Okay, this is a good one. Hundreds of billions of dollars. Thank you.
Gentlelady is recognized for an additional 1 minute.
Thank you. Hundreds of billions of dollars in tax credits that actually go to, in some cases, it can go to, and it will go to, we're already seeing that, Chinese companies. Companies that are affiliated with the Chinese Communist government, all while destroying American energy here at home. Reliable, affordable American energy. And that is the reason, by the way, the destruction of that industry by the left is the reason why we're seeing costs of energy skyrocket for American families, as well as food costs skyrocket for the American families. The spending and the anti-energy policies that they've put forward in the 2 years when they had complete control is a reason why we see so much hardship for American families today. And so the last thing is, well, work requirements are a good thing. People should want to participate and contribute to our economy. It will help the labor shortage issues that we're seeing, while giving people the ability to self-determine their future, not be dependent on government. We need those programs. It's critically important for us to encourage people. And by the way, we're talking about people.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would remind all that in Georgia 3, there will be $2.6 billion worth of tax credits. Ohio 15, $4.5 billion worth of tax credits. West Virginia 1, $22 million worth of tax credits. That's not the Chinese. That's for the American family. Let me yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel, knowledgeable about Social Security and Medicare.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
And Mr. Speaker, make no mistake about it. Extremists in this Congress are trying to hold us hostage. Republicans have given us a ransom note. Choose between wrecking our economy or wrecking our families. Lose jobs and retirement funds or inflict cruel pain on American families. More children going to bed hungry. More women dying at childbirth. More parents without child care. More neighborhoods without police. More evictions, more drug overdoses, more veteran suicides, and more carbon in the air, more misery. Make no mistake, Republicans are willing to sacrifice Americans in order to protect tax cuts for the very wealthy and for big corporations. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts with 6 1/4 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to the very capable gentlelady from California and a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Ms. Chu.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in strong opposition to this irresponsible bill that would hurt millions of seniors, workers, families, and veterans. If this bill becomes law, the Social Security Administration will close field offices that seniors and people with disabilities rely on for services. Nearly 500,000 low-income families could be evicted from voucher-supported housing. 200,000 young children will lose spots in Head Start. Cruel barriers to TANF will mean grandparents who rely on the program to keep their grandchildren out of foster care will lose crucial resources. Meanwhile, Republicans want to cut law enforcement funding and give wealthy tax cheats license to avoid paying taxes they owe. And what do we get in exchange for over a decade of crippled government? Less than 1 year of reprieve from default and economic catastrophe. Republicans should do what they did 3 times under President Trump and pass a clean bill free of brutal cuts. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri.
I reserve.
He reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 90 seconds to the very capable gentleman from New York, Congressman Ryan.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 1/2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in strong opposition to the Default on America Act. I risk my life in combat because I believe in this country, in our strength, and in our compassion. And this bill falls far short of those American values. In New York alone, my home state, it threatens food assistance to 54,000 people and cuts preschool and childcare for 17,000 kids. It puts at risk Meals on Wheels for over 1 million seniors nationwide and would cut $30 billion in support to our veterans. I don't know about my colleagues, but I believe in a country where we don't let our kids and our seniors go hungry, and we never break faith with our veterans. The cuts in this bill are just cruel, and they would have catastrophic consequences for American families. In combat, it was my sacred duty to make sure we left no one behind, and this bill leaves far too many Americans behind. I implore my colleagues of both parties to instead pass a clean debt ceiling increase. And I ask unanimous consent to add the text of this amendment to the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit.
Gentleman from Missouri. Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're prepared to close. Does that be the position of the chairman?
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
And how much time do I have, Mr. Speaker?
3 3/4 minutes remaining.
Thank you. So I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your impeccable fairness once again as you've presided over this chamber, as usual. And I want to call attention to the argument I made at the outset as to how we got to where we are today. This is a manageable issue that men and women of good sense and good instinct could come together to find a solution. The debt to GDP ratio, I understand the argument. But does that take into consideration a pandemic, aid to Ukraine, stopping the hostility of Putin's aggression, back to our obligation for those who voted for the PATH Act here, to come to the aid of our veterans? How about the infrastructure bill that Republicans, some of whom voted for? How about the CHIPS Act, some of whom these Republicans voted for? How about the extraordinary increases in defense spending as China threatens America in the Straits of Taiwan, South China Seas? These are all parts of votes that both parties have cast. These are parts of the obligations that we have to members of the American family. So they suggest, well, if we just chop Medicaid, and you know, earlier today, Mr. Speaker, it should be noted, this exclamation point that they've added to the argument that we have no intention of cutting Social Security or Medicare. Great, that's nice to hear. But there are members of the Republican leadership in the Senate who have said precisely the opposite, and they would put Medicare and Social Security on the chopping block. And our side should not be restrained by calling attention to that, despite the debate that takes place in this chamber. So the spending challenges that we have as they relate to defense, where every Republican voted, I believe, for that defense budget, and the substantial increases that have taken place, that has been an act of responsibility based upon what happens with Putin and President Xi and others who would threaten freedom across the globe. When we look at this argument that has been presented to the American people today, I want to ask you about their 401k plans. As they allow this argument to be pursued, the markets are going to begin to reflect this in coming days. When people are going to pull back from investment, people are going to pull back from what ordinarily would be an act of good fiscal prudence, and people are going to begin to pay a great deal of attention to this. And the argument that Democrats have offered today is really simple. You and us, we were responsible for these increases in spending. Let's have a vote on a clean debt resolution here and then proceed to negotiation and discussion. I've heard this argument when former President Bush never vetoed one spending bill during 8 years as president. I've seen this argument when we cut taxes without the help of us by $1.3 trillion in 2001, and by the way, another trillion in 2003 with the subsequent invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and 1.5 million new veterans. These are our obligations. Even though we disagreed by and large with those positions that were adopted by the then majority, you recognize the reality that the tally and the credit card is in front of us. When you get the credit card, you don't get to say, well, I don't like the part of the bill that I've run up here, so I'm not going to pay it. Or you don't say, I'll only pay this. The bill is in front of us. The full faith and credit of the United States is in front of us. I made reference earlier today to the fiscal probity of the Republican Party when I first came here. Whatever happened to the Republican Party when it relates to fiscal prudence and probity? We pay our bills, and we don't threaten the currency of the United States, where that dollar is recognized everywhere across the globe. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized with 4 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've heard the other side numerous times today to say that we need to just pick up and pass a blank check debt limit increase. The United States Senate, which is controlled by the Democrats, couldn't even pass what President Biden and the House Democrats have been suggesting on this floor. If they could, they would have already passed it. But even Democrat senators on the other side of the building said they will not support an absolute blank check debt limit because they're concerned about the fiscal state of America. Today, the contrast could not be clearer. On the one hand, we have President Biden and Washington Democrats who have proposed zero solutions for getting America's fiscal house in order or addressing the inflation crisis. For months, they have delayed and denied real discussions while they fought to preserve special interest tax breaks for big banks, corporations, and the Chinese Communist Party. On the other hand, Republicans stand with working families. We have an actual plan that will rein in runaway spending to fight inflation. It will save taxpayer dollars by canceling handouts to the wealthy and big corporations, and it will grow the economy. The American people are sick and tired of business as usual in Washington. With today's vote, we are sending a message to the president. It's time to stop your reckless behavior and negotiate, and instead stand up and talk with Congress and deliver for the American people. The American people are demanding it. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time for debate is expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 327, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Ayes have it.